Judges chapter 4 on page 263 in our church Bible. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, now that Ehud was dead. So the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, king of Canaan, Horin in Hazor. Sisera, the commander of his army, was based in Harosheth Hagoyim. Because he had 900 chariots fitted with iron and had cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years, they cried to the Lord for help. Now Deborah, a prophet, the wife of Lapidos, was leading Israel at that time. She held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went up to her to have their disputes decided. She sent for Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go, take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun, and lead them up to Mount Tabor. I will lead Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his troops to the river of Kishon, and give him into your hands." Barak said to her, "If you go with me, I will go, but if you don't go with me, I won't go." "Certainly I will go with you," said Deborah, "but because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh. There Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali, and 10,000 men went up under his command. Deborah also went up with him. Now Heber the Kenite had left the other Kenites, the descendants of Hobab, Moses' brother-in-law, and pitched his tent by the great tree in Zananim near Kadesh. When they told Sisera that Barak, son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor, Sisera summoned from Harosheth Hagoyim to the river Kishon all his men and his 900 chariots fitted with iron. Then Deborah said to Barak, "Go, this is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you?" So Barak went down Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. At Barak's advance, the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and army by the sword, and Sisera got down from his chariot and fled on foot. Barak pursued the chariots and army as far as Harosheth Hagoyim, and all Sisera's troops fell by the sword. Not a man was left. Sisera, meanwhile, fled on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, because there was an alliance between Jabin, king of Hazor, and the family of Heber the Kenite. Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Come, my lord, come right in, don't be afraid." So he entered her tent and she covered him with a blanket. "I'm thirsty," he said, "please give me some water." She opened a skin of milk and gave him a drink and covered him up. "Stand in the doorway of the tent," he told her. "If someone comes and asks you, 'Is anyone in there?' say no." But Jael, Heber's wife, picked up a tent peg and a hammer and went quietly to him while he lay fast asleep, exhausted. She drove the peg through his temple into the ground, and he died. Just then Barak came by in pursuit of Sisera, and Jael went out to him to meet him. "Come," she said, "I will show you the man you're looking for." So he went in with her, and there lay Sisera with the tent peg through his temple, dead. On that day God subdued Jabin, king of Canaan, before the Israelites, and the hand of the Israelites pressed harder and harder against Jabin, king of Canaan, until they destroyed him.
Well, thank you very much, Phoebe. Didn't you do well? Because there's a lot of unusual names and pronunciations and things in there. Thank you very much for doing that. Do keep those verses open in front of you, page 263. If you use one of the church Bibles, I will refer to some of those verses as we go through another unusual and striking story. Some of these stories from Judges are more familiar than others. This is maybe one that's slightly less familiar to people, but it's very striking. with a hand. But you read it and think, oh man. But we're going to dive into it because I think there's some useful things that we can draw out for us in 2024. Let's just pray before we go any further. Father, we know these events taking place so long ago, more than 3,000 years ago. It all feels very remote for us, far away, and places and names that we don't really recognise or know. But Father, I pray that you'd help us by your Spirit to see why you've included this in the Bible, and also that you'd help us to see what relevance it has for us today. Amen. Well, there's one or two jokes that children learn and that you will probably have heard before. I'll give you an example. And I think you'll know the punchline, this one actually has various punchlines. What is black and white and red all over? So have a chat with your neighbour. Do you know the answer to that one? What's black and white and red all over? I think that the traditional answer was a newspaper, because it's black and white and you read it all over. But you might have also said a sunburnt penguin. So that's another one. Any other one? No? Okay. There we go. Okay. What about this one? What do you get if you cross a kangaroo with a sheep? Do you know that one? Have a quick chat with your neighbour. Oh, yeah. If you cross a kangaroo with a sheep. Anyone?
A woolly jumper.
A woolly jumper. There we go. What was the policeman's home address? He lived at 999 Lettsby Avenue. There we go. So, if English isn't your first language, that last one might be a bit. You might think, what's going on with these strange English people? But why am I telling you that? Why are we telling jokes in church? I'm telling you that because we're very familiar with the concept that there's a setup and then there's a punchline, we'll call it. There's sort of the whole little twist on what we're expecting or the thing that makes it funny. And actually, with many stories, and that could be a story in a book or a story that's told in a TV program or a film, a story that's being told, often there's a lot of setup or there's a crisis or a problem, and then it gets resolved. Things build towards a grand finale or a big ending or whatever, and we're used to that way of doing things. That's how kind of stories work very often. But that's true in our culture here in the West and in the UK now. But there are different cultures around the world. There are different ways of thinking about things. And in ancient Israel, often the main point of a story or the main thing could come in the middle, not at the end. It wouldn't build towards the final climax. Things would be structured differently. Now that would be quite unusual for us, but it was more common then. And it comes quite a bit in the Old Testament. You get an unusual structure in a story and a main point that comes in the middle. It can look a bit like this. So the next slide will just show us. So often a story can be structured so things are paired together. The bit at the beginning and the bit at the end kind of are the same. And then the second bit and the bit just before the end are kind of the same. And it works towards the centre of the story can be a turning point in the story, but not always. It's sometimes just the main point. And actually, Judges chapter 4 is a brilliant example of this, but it's hard for us to spot it because we're not used to thinking about stories or things in that way. But here's a sort of basic outline of what's going on in this chapter. At the start, Israel is oppressed. At the very end, we see that the people who are oppressing them, the Canaanites, they are subdued. So we've got two different people who are sort of pushed down, but it's that's the sort of progress of the story. We're introduced to Deborah, who's the prophetess, in the second part, verses 4 to 9. At the end of the story, we meet this lady Jael, who's the lady in the tent with the tent putting up equipment. And the third sort of scene, we get Barak and Sisera. They're both described as going out, and it's the same word in the original language is used to describe what they're doing in 10 to 13. And then we also see them both going down. Again, in the original language, it's the same word that is used for them, for what's happening to them, verse 14b to verse 16. And all of that is pointing us to what's happening in verse 14. Let me just read verse 14 for us. So if you're using one of the church Bibles, on page 263, we're at the fourth column, 2/3 of the way down. Verse 14, then Deborah said to Barak, "Go, this is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you?" So she's telling him that God has organized for them to be able to defeat their enemy. That's the big point in this story. The great sort of climax of the story, really, although it doesn't come at the end, it comes in the middle. And this structure kind of points you to that. Now, I've just taken a bit of time to explain that because we don't often see it. This structure is called it's called a chiasm, that thing. You don't need to worry about that. But it's not there in everything in the Old Testament, but it comes up quite a bit, and it's used. It's often a poetic style. You see it often in some psalms, and it's worth just knowing about because the original readers would have spotted this and would have realised verse 14 is where the real heart, the action is really. Now, this story also follows the other pattern that we've been seeing in Judges, which is this cycle that we've been seeing of God's people rejecting God and chasing after other things, God allowing them to be attacked by their enemies, them crying out to God for help, and then God provides a judge and a rescue and a time of peace. That also, you'll have seen that maybe as it was read for us. That's also happening and at work in this story. Well, let's dive in with all that sort of preamble. Let's dive in with that knowledge in our heads into chapter 4. I've got three things I particularly want us to see, or three things that are going to take us through the chapter. There's a terrible calamity for Israel as we meet them at the start. There's a divine intervention that leads to victory. That's verse 14, we've already seen that. God's going to step in and bring them victory. And there's a surprise headache for the enemy. So let's dive into the first one of those. A terrible calamity for Israel. They, just back towards the end of the previous chapter, they've had a period of peace for 80 years. 80 years, quite a long time, isn't it? After Ehud, who we met last week, if you weren't here last week, that talk's available online. We met Ehud, and he successfully rescues them from their oppressors, and then they have 80 years of peace. And that's actually the longest period of peace that is recorded in the book of Judges, and things have been going well for them. But sadly, chapter 4, verse 1 opens telling us that they again turn back to evil. Ehud is now dead, verse 1 tells us. Not surprising after 80 years of peace. But now they turn back to evil ways. I was talking to one of my daughters recently about discipline in the classroom in secondary school. and about her experience of that as a new teacher in her first year of teaching at a school where there's a lot of scallywags. I don't know what your school days were like, or what the sort of culture and way of doing things was like in your school. But in my school, and I wouldn't want to say my school was rough, but in the toilets, they took all the doors off the individual cubicles in the toilets to stop people being bullied in the toilets, basically. So they thought if people can just sing in, then people can't get up to bad things and flush people's heads down the toilet and stuff. But it meant you just didn't go to the toilet, really. I think it's just anyway. But so it was somewhat rough at my school. But anyway, I don't know what your experience of school was like, but there was probably a difference in the behaviour of children if the teacher was in the classroom or the teacher had nipped out to go to I was going to say to the photocopier, but in my day I think it was a duplicating machine. Some of us will remember those. You had to turn a handle. There's a few nods. a few nods, and people, younger folk are thinking, what is that? What are you on about? Anyway, before photocopiers. But anyway, there was a difference in behaviour. This is the point. The difference in behaviour in the class, if the teacher's present or not. The teacher's nipped out, the behaviour could deteriorate pretty fast. Maybe that was just my school, but I think that's probably a fairly common thing. While the teacher's eye is on you, your behaviour might be different. They've gone, the behaviour deteriorates. I think there's a little bit of a sense of that in chapter 4, verse 1. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Now the Ehud was dead. They had the judge. They had the guy who'd rescued them from what was going on. They had somebody who was helping point them to what God wanted. He's gone, and very quickly they revert back to their old behaviour. That points to a fact that it was the external influence that was meaning they were behaving in a certain way, not actually something coming from within that was to do with their hearts wanting to do something a certain way. And we probably all know the difference between doing something just because of an external influence or doing something because that is what our heart wants us to do. And I think for us in 2024, and if we consider ourselves a Christian, and perhaps you're here just checking out at church and what Christians believe this morning, and you wouldn't call yourself a Christian, and you're most welcome if that's you. We're thrilled that you're here with us. But I guess a lot of people here would describe ourselves as Christian. We would say we try and live in a Christian way, but we maybe all know the challenge of doing that when we're aware that people are watching, or whether or not we want to do that just because it's what our heart wants to do. Just because of our love for the Lord, or our desire to do what He wants, and He's always watching, of course, compared with doing something because other people will notice. And we maybe all know that difference. And here, I think that's exactly what we see in the people of Israel, and it doesn't reflect very well on them, does it? Well, we're introduced in verse 2 to Jabin, who is described as king of Canaan. Now, the Canaanites were made up of various, it was really a confederacy of different city-states and things. They would all have their own sort of king or person in charge. He's maybe sort of heading up the confederacy of states. But there's this other guy we're introduced to in verse 3, Sisera, who's the sort of hard-man enforcer for them. He seems to be the commander of, was described as the commander of Jabin's army in verse 7. And they are equipped with the cutting-edge technology of the day. They have chariots. Israel does not have chariots. They have not just chariots, but chariots of iron. Not just a few chariots, 900 chariots. And that was the crucial technological advantage in warfare in those days. I used to have a book when I was a kid. It was all about the Second World War, and it had a very striking picture of the early days of the Second World War as the German Nazi forces were invading Poland, and there was a very brave defence being put up by some members of the Polish armed forces who were attempting a cavalry charge against panzers. And this was captured in, I think it was a painting maybe or something, but it was in this book that I had. I don't think it went so well for the Polish side. Because although a cavalry charge had been a very effective military method for a long, long time, centuries and centuries, by 1939 it was less effective, and particularly if you're up against tanks. And it's that sort of thing that the original readers of this would be understanding when it's telling us in verse 3 they had 900 chariots fitted with iron. And the Israelite side did not have that. They did not have that. So even though they might be able to amass a lot of numbers, there was this great advantage in technology that the enemy had. They could have archers on the chariots. They could whiz up, fire a load of arrows, bomb away again. They could encircle. They could move quickly, etc., etc. So that has allowed them to do what verse 3 tells us. They cruelly oppressed the Israelites. It wasn't just that they'd taken over and they were now sort of calling the shots. They were doing that in a cruel way. They were oppressing God's people. And God's people had really brought this upon themselves and maybe should have known better if they had just looked to their recent history. Well, this goes on for 20 years. If you were here last week, the previous occasion, it had been 18 years. It's getting a little bit worse here, 20 years now. Now, there's an interesting little thing going on here in this story because chapter 4 tells us what happens, tells us the story. Chapter 5, which we didn't have time to read, but chapter 5 is recording a song sung by Deborah, the lady that we meet here, and the song is about what happened. She's put into song what's gone on, and it gives us a few more details about the story. So we haven't had time to read it, but I'll just point out to you that chapter 5, verse 6, 7 and 8 tells us a little bit about what life was like under this cruel oppression. And one of the things it says, verse 6 of chapter 5, in those days, the highways were abandoned. Travellers took to winding paths. Why are people doing that? I think they're terrified. You know, some chariots might come charging along this road. Well, not this road, but a road. So you stayed off the roads. You had to take like back routes and things just to stay away from these people. And just, you know, who knows what might happen if you bumped into them charging around the countryside in their chariots. It just gives you a little flavour. The people are living in fear. Towards the end of chapter 5, in her song, she talks about Sisera, who comes to this terrible end, that the leader of the army. She talks about his mum, wondering when he's getting back. I suppose she's just imagining this, but there's many times he'd been out on a mission or out cruelly oppressing the Israelites, and then he's come back. And his mum's kind of waiting for him to come back. It's slightly odd, isn't it, that she's included that. But the bit just in 28, just towards the end of chapter 5, she's peering out the windows, wondering, you know, when will he get back? When will I hear the clatter of these iron chariots coming back? And what's she waiting for? Well, he comes back. When he comes back, he normally comes back with plunder. He normally comes back with stuff he's pinched. Or, he's butchered a village and robbed all their stuff or whatever. And there's just a little detail that she puts in there they come back with 2 women for each man. They come back with 2 women for each man. They're just stealing the young girls, butchering people, robbing people. It's all sort of rape and pillage, I think, is what that's pointing us to. The Israelites are in a bad way. This terrible calamity has come upon them, and the situation is bad. Well, that's the setup for us. That's what we're supposed to understand, I think, from this opening part. Secondly, let's go on to this divine intervention that brings victory. I haven't got an actual photo of one of the chariots, but this is just to give you an idea of the sort of thing. There might be a second guy on there with a bow and arrow or whatever normally, but this is, it would be quite a terrifying thing to be charging towards you, I think, wouldn't it? Now God raises up a courageous and wise woman, Deborah, to be judge. She gives judgment and helps the people. She's also described in verse 4 as a prophetess or a prophet, which is unusual in the Bible, but it's not unique. For example, Miriam, who's Moses' sister in Exodus 15, she's described as a prophet as well. And in the New Testament, Anna, who's the old lady who meets Jesus in Luke, Jesus as a baby in Luke 2, she's also described as a prophet or prophetess in Luke 2:36. There's some other examples as well. Now, there is a question mark here over whether the fact that there's a woman leading Israel is a positive thing or not. That's not a reflection on women's ability, but it's more a reflection on how God has set things up. If you want to think more about that topic, I would recommend this book by Tim Keller, Judges for You, whereas it goes into that in a little bit of depth and talks about that over quite a few pages. But we won't get into that now, and I think there are 2 sides to that argument. But that's just worth being aware that that's a thing that there's a lot of debate on to do with Deborah. But Deborah is certainly a courageous and wise woman, and she's raised up by God in this situation. And she has a message for this guy, Barak. And the message is, get together, 10,000 brothers, get together an army, and you need to fight against these guys. We're going to actually set a trap for them. We discover in verse 8 that Barak's a little bit unsure about it, and he wants her help. He does get a bad press for this, but it certainly would have been a scary prospect, even though the numbers look like it favours him. 10,000 versus just 900 chariots. The chariots are maybe equipped with 2 or 3 people per chariot, so it's not quite as unbalanced as it sounds, but there's this huge advantage that the chariots give. But she says to him, verse 7, God's going to give him into your hands. God will give the victory. And just so that we know that that's not just by chance what happens, verse 9 tells us that the leader of the enemy is going to be killed, and it's going to involve a woman. Is going to be given over into the hands of a woman. It is given as a detail about something that's going to happen in the future, so that we're in a sort of unlikely way, because the army is made up of men. So an unlikely detail about the future that helps us to know that this is God is ordaining what is happening here. It's a bit like saying, a baby's going to be born. I'll send a baby. Let me give you an unusual detail so you know it's the right one. His mum will be a virgin. It's that kind of thing. God giving a detail about something that's going to happen in the future, which seems a little bit unlikely and surprising, but it's like this will be the stamp of authenticity, so you know that it's me doing this. It's that kind of idea, I think, is what's going on here. Now, just before we go on, I just need to point out verse 11. So if you're using one of the church Bibles, column 4, halfway down. Verse 11, it stands out like a bit of a sore thumb here, because we've got this whole setup about the people being oppressed. We've got this plan of how they're going to fight against them. And then suddenly we get a little bit of information about somebody we've not met thus far, who's not even from the area. And it's just a little bit of a detail about them moving house and setting up their tent. It just seems like an odd detail. And you can actually read from the end of verse 10 straight on to verse 12, missing out verse 11, and the story just flows perfectly. And verse 11 is just this odd detail about this Heber, the Kenites, the Kenites are from way south. And he's suddenly pitching up his tent nearby. He's got some sort of loose alliance with these people with the chariots, and it might be that the Kenites worked with iron, and they might be nearby just to do some blacksmith work or something. I don't know. But anyway, we just got this sudden detail about them setting up tent nearby. But it becomes significant later. Anyway, let's move on. There's this divine intervention, but let's move to our third thing, a surprising headache for the enemy. Now, there's a key detail in verse 13, and the detail is that Sisera is gathering his forces by the river Kishon. And that is a key detail. Back in the First World War, the 1914-1918 war, this is a photo of some forces near that very same location by this river. These are actually Bengal Lancers. So this is a cavalry, a bunch of cavalry soldiers, part of the British Empire from India, who were fighting on our side, obviously, as Empire forces, in the very same area that this event is taking place, but this photo is taken during that period of the Bengal Lancers. There you go. Amazing. So they're right there by the River Kishon. Now that's going to become significant in a moment. And they're right there in verse 13, and then the very next verse, verse 14, it's our central verse. That verse, it tells us that Deborah says to Barak, "Go, this is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you?" She says, now's the moment. Now God is going to do it. And they do prevail. They do win. They advance. The Lord, verse 15, the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots, and they all get put to the sword. Sisera got down from his chariot and fled on foot. Does that strike you as unusual? He gets down from his chariot and he flees on foot. Which would be quicker? Which would be quicker? The chariot would be quicker. The other guys haven't got chariots. Make a fast getaway. What are you doing getting down from your chariot and fleeing on foot? It seems odd until you know what happened to the Bengal Lancers in the First World War. There's a guy, John Garstang, who wrote a commentary on Judges, and he was writing 13 years after the First World War. So it's an old commentary from the start of the 1930s, and he talks about what happened to the Bengal Lancers in this very same area, and he said it was all a brilliant area for horses because it's very dry, but he said they had this sort of flash rain downpour, and he said within 15 minutes the ground became so slippery that horses couldn't be used anymore. Within 15 minutes of this rain downpour. That happened to these forces in the First World War. That's very interesting, isn't it? Because suddenly Sisera is abandoning his chariot and fleeing on foot. And do you know what? Deborah, in her song, gives us a bit more detail. Come with me to chapter 5, verse 20. Chapter 5, verse 20, just over the page. She said, "From the heavens the stars fought from their courses. They fought against Sisera. The river Kishon swept them away." The age-old river, the river Kishon. God organised some sort of flash flood or heavy downpour or something that meant that the big advantage they had, the chariots and the horses, became a liability. They became something that you had to abandon. They became something that was unusable. And suddenly now you've got these 900 charioteers and then maybe the associated archers or whatever forces they had that were going to be super mobile and able to run rings around the Israelite forces. Suddenly they're massively outnumbered by the Israelite forces who are on foot, less affected by the slippery ground, and they're able to win. They're able to win. It's also interesting, if you were one of the first readers of this, because the Canaanite god Baal, who they worshipped, was said to be a god of storms and thunder, and a bit like Thor in Norse mythology. He was supposed to be able to control this stuff, and here he absolutely hasn't. So Sisera is on foot, he's on the run, and suddenly that tent that we heard about earlier becomes really significant because he decides to hide out in the tent and jail this lady whose tent it is, who gets bossed about a bit by him, bring me a drink and all this kind of stuff. She finishes him off. It's another gruesome story. Last week's story is pretty gruesome. Here we've got another gruesome story. We don't know exactly why she did it, but we do know that for 20 years this guy's been treating women as plunder. And do you know, did she have a relative or friend, a daughter or mother or somebody that had been caught up in all that? We don't know. It might have just been the way he spoke to her. Or we don't know. It would be speculation, wouldn't it? But something drove her to drive the tent peg through his head. It's a very sort of, it's a comic moment, but it's a very dark comedy. In both verse 21 and verse 22, both have the same sort of comic thing. Verse 21, she drove the peg through his temple. That's this part of your head. She drove the peg, sleeping. She drove the peg through his temple into the ground, and then totally unneeded at the end, and he died. Like, you just don't need that, do you? You don't need that extra bit. And they do it does it exactly the same. In verse 22, she's showing Barak now. She went in, there lay Sisera, a tent peg through his temple, into the ground, dead. You just don't need that extra word. Of course he is. And what a mess, and how horrific, how terrible. Well, that's the story. That's what's going on in the story. A very sort of standout story. And again we see that God has been at work. God has been the hero. God is the hero of every Old Testament story. It's not telling us to act like those people acted in the specifics, but it's telling us some important things. And here's a couple of lessons from all of this for us in 2024. And the first is that sin leads to danger and it leads to division. Sin, thinking we know better than God, turning our backs on God, doing our own thing, it leads to danger and it leads to division. In her song in chapter 5, Deborah calls out some of the 12 tribes. You might know Israel's made up of 12 tribes. The call has gone out to come and fight against the enemy. Some of the tribes just don't come. They just don't turn up. And she calls them out in her song and says, where were you when we needed you to help? They just haven't turned up. And what's happening as Israel descends into this sort of spiral of sin and things getting worse and worse in the book of Judges, it starts to be that it's every man for himself. It's every man for himself. People aren't acting as they should. And we'll see that more as we go on. people just not supporting one another like they should. The tribes, there's division between the tribes that make up Israel. People are focusing on their own needs and not thinking about others. And of course, we know that temptation as well, don't we? We know that temptation to do that. Hear what the Apostle Paul says in Philippians 2. It's on the screen for us. The Apostle Paul in Philippians 2, speaking to Christian people, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. Think about others. But sin says think about yourself. You're number one. Put yourself at the centre. The world revolves around me. And we see sin having that effect, causing division and leading to all kinds of dangerous things. A second thing to notice is that God will judge sin. Now, what happens here is awful. Somebody said to me after last week, that's awful, isn't it? That guy got a sword stabbed into him. Absolutely awful what's happening. And here we've got a guy with a tent peg in his head. It's awful what is happening. God will judge sin, though. One day we will all stand before God. And God isn't particularly down on these people. God is against sin. God is against sin, and we are all sinners. Will you, when one day you stand before God and give an account, be able to say, I'm standing with Jesus? Or would Jesus say, I never knew you? Because we all sin, and God will judge sin. And unless we trust in Jesus, there are serious consequences. Now, it's actually good news that God will judge sin. Bullies will be dealt with. The cruel oppression that we were told about in verse 2, or the rape and pillage that's hinted at in chapter 5 verse 30, people don't get away with it. God will judge sin. So it's good news that God will judge sin, but it's also bad news if it wasn't for the cross of Christ. Of all the gory stories in the Bible, the cross has got to be the goriest, the most awful. But the cross, among many other things, is a massive visual aid to us of how serious sin is, of how serious the consequences of sin is, of what punishment can look like. But it also wonderfully points us to the fact that Jesus will take the punishment we deserve for sin, if only we will trust him. Have a look at these verses in 2 Corinthians 5, where Paul says, be reconciled to God. Don't be God's enemy. Don't turn your back on him. Turn to him. Be reconciled to God. God made him, Jesus, who had no sin, to be sin for us. If we turn to him in repentance and faith, Jesus can take our sin so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. So we can do this great trade. Jesus taking our sin, we taking his righteousness. It's a fantastic offer. And stories like the story we've looked at today remind us of how serious sin is, how serious the consequence is. And so although it's terrible to read about what happened to this guy, one of the things it should do is point us to remember that actually none of us deserve a quiet life or God to be gracious to us. All of us have sinned. All of us deserve judgment because of that. But Jesus is offering this fantastic, fantastic exchange. God has made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for these stories that you've included for us in the Bible, so alien and weird and far away for us, and yet things that you can, ways that you can speak to us and things that you can teach us from these stories. Father, I pray that you'd help us to see that sin is serious, that it's so foolish to turn away from you and to sin. And Father, I pray that you'd help us to see just how brilliant it is that Jesus came and paid a price for sin. Father, I pray that you'd help us to keep these things in mind as we go into a new week and in days to come. Amen.